I work with sellers and CPG brands from around the world, and the US market is the market to be in. Now, it's quite tough to understand how the US structure works. We do live in a world where you've got a TikTok expert telling you how easy it is to register an LLC and start selling. Generally, those things are not ending well. It's not becoming easier. These things are now becoming zero tolerant. There's no shortcuts when setting these things up. Don't mess around to try and save a few grand. Do it properly on day one. Otherwise, you get this horrible surprise 3 years down the line because of a painful verification. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're speaking with Scott from NCP. And Scott's got a great business about launching with confidence. And this is all about helping with US expansion for non-resident e-commerce sellers. And quite frankly, Scott, you're the only guy I send people to. Welcome. Thanks for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Pleasure to be here today.
Great. Scott, so you've got quite a unique business, right? You're not just opening up LLCs like an agency. And I don't think people realize how complicated this space really is, especially for Amazon sellers. Just before we get going, could you just give us a quick intro of how you landed up doing what you're doing with Launch with Confidence?
I started over 28 years ago in this industry. And like a lot of people, I worked for a company prior that formed LLCs and corporations in the United States. And I was always one of those people that did research. I kind of questioned what we did as a company, and I kind of read other things that maybe, is this the way it really works? And my brain was always like, this sounds like it's too easy. Maybe there's more involved. So when I started my company, one of the first things I did when it came to forming companies for U.S. residents is look at what's called the multi-state taxation rules, which is a very complex set of rules. When does your company have to register in another state? And this also applies to non-residents, because you might do something inadvertently that causes you to need to foreign register in another state and trigger some unnecessary taxes, or you may not be in compliance. So I went to the biggest firm I could to get the right answers, which was Deloitte. And I actually worked with a top multi-state taxation expert back in the first couple years, 98, 99. And I created a lot of content about if you form a company, when do you have to foreign register? So that helps today when we get into Nexus, sales tax compliance, some of those things. And in fact, that connection helped me get to the tax team at Amazon to get a private meeting about the 18-month inventory issue a couple of years ago because of working with Deloitte specifically. So that's where I started, and I always was kind of a contrarian, like what doesn't work? And because of that, and I went out and hired attorneys, CPAs on other strategies that were promoted that seemed very simple, but I knew there was more beneath the surface, like, this sounds too good to be true. I think we've all had that. Like, that really seems so simple, but I always look for the exceptions. And I think that's where we've always protected our clients. So it began back then. And then over the years, probably like many of you who are sellers, I would get different answers. And it was very frustrating. Why do I talk to one accountant and get one answer and talk to another accountant and get a different answer? And then talk to a tax attorney, get a third answer. I'm like, how come everybody's not on the same page about this stuff? And I realized that depending upon who you go to and what their level of expertise are, they might just be doing sole proprietorship returns. They don't do partnership returns, corporate returns, work with non-residents. All these are different niches. And then I find that I'm in a tax and legal mastermind group, of which of 700 people, I would say 80%, everybody's on the same page. But guess what? 20%, people see it slightly differently. Some people feel more comfortable with IRS audits. Some people are going to say, I don't want to deal with an audit because my client's going to yell at me if we're in an audit. And some have the opposite attitude, like, hey, we can save you a lot of money now, but you might get audited and you have to pay an hourly rate to defend yourself. So I worked with a lot of high-level professionals over the years. In around 2015, I shifted more to e-commerce. I've spoken internationally in Australia, New Zealand, the UK about forming U.S. companies. But I was asked to do research and input on sales tax compliance for Amazon sellers. And my first reaction is like, why are you asking me? Go to your CPA expert at that time. TaxJar was the first player. They had Avalara too, of course. But they wanted specific insights, and I went and hired the best. So I got into sales tax. We created a step-by-step process. We did thousands of registrations. Of course, that's changed dramatically after 2018. There's still some responsibilities. And then over the last couple of years, I've become an Amazon agency partner. I've been a Shopify partner, most recently now a TikTok Shop partner. And we focus a lot on the verification issues, the tax strategies, before you just go form an LLC and start guessing what happens. It all has to be planned out. So I love working with entrepreneurs globally in all different countries around the world, helping them solve these problems. I got an amazing team that we have so many internal spreadsheets and checklists and things to make sure everything lines up when we work with people. So that's, how I got here till this point today. And we, love working with entrepreneurs and find out what's working, what's not working, and help them solve problems when they need to, which unfortunately comes up often when we talk about compliance and verification issues.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about the verification and compliance so frequently. So one of the things that we get a lot, right, when I'm talking to sellers, is someone's watched a YouTube short or a TikTok video. They're based in the UK or Australia or Germany, and it just seems like, oh, you just open an LLC and you pay no taxes in America and you can just trade and life's all hunky-dory. But then they go do it and suddenly they can't get verified, they can't get a bank account. What is the significance of a proper US business setup for this non-resident founder? Can you dig into that a bit more? Because I think there's a lot of people with misconceptions that it's easy, right?
And from one aspect, the Secretary of State's finally figured out about 10 years ago they actually run a business. So they've improved their websites to make it easier. So I get why people think it's easy. There's a couple check boxes. Most of them are simple. Most of the big online incorporating companies, one of the big simple mistakes is, if I'm going to form a single member LLC, disregard the United States. Well, because it's one person by default, most of these companies, it will be managed by a member, not managed by a manager, which gives you flexibility. Even if you're in somewhere like Delaware and Wyoming, where the quote unquote member, quote unquote owner doesn't show up in state records. So that simple mistake about how is your LLC managed will impact verification down the road. We'll get into details on that. So that's one of the things that people miss. For example, when people work with us, our LLC order form is, I guarantee, the longest in the industry, because we want to know what marketplace you're going to go on, what banking or transfer area you're going to do, who are the owners, do you have partners. So if we're going on TikTok Shop, you can't have a foreign entity own more than 76%, you're going to get rejected. So we know that, so we gather this information, and then our team will respond with, I know you said you wanted this, but you checked TikTok and Amazon, and but you wanted Relay, or I should say you wanted Mercury for a single member LLC, and that's not going to work. Oh, you already set up your Amazon account is what you told your team, so the single member LLC is not going to work. So these are things that we dive into that is literally for us the starting point about verification. So what ends up happening is a lot of people, of course, simple click, 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 go file something. And a lot of people don't know, for example, at the IRS, we can't amend the SS4. We can change the address over several weeks. And time is money, right? So if you got the wrong address on the SS4, and that's part of the verification process, and we have to file, a 8822B and change the address, and that takes 6 weeks for it to be updated in Amazon, well, guess what? That's another 6 weeks to your verification process. So these are all the things we like to anticipate, or at least some of the things we anticipate on the front end before you just go, fire, aim, and we want to plan first. That's the theme.
I think I've been guilty of that myself. I've had LLCs, you jump onto wyomingagents.com and you just register your, LLC, and then suddenly you can't get your Mercury or bank account open, right? Or suddenly you don't get through the Amazon, tax interview documentation process. So,
Yeah, I tested one recently where I was looking perhaps for a partner for the volume, and like I said earlier, they only did LLCs managed by members. I wanted to be managed by a manager, and they didn't have that option. I communicated with chat. This is vitally important. They said, "Don't worry about it." To clarify, I wanted to say, I'm the manager. My company's going to be the member. I want profits to flow here for various reasons, and just to give them the full picture. And what did they do? They filed it as managed by members with my company as the member, and that's not what I wanted. We had to amend it, but now when you amend it, your articles always have the original, in this case, Wyoming doesn't have it, but I did it in Nevada, so it was on there. And so we can overcome those things, but it was unnecessary. It should not have happened.
And you can cause delays, right? So when people are causing these delays, they're losing money. I think that's an important thing for them to realize.
Yeah, 100%. People, we know in business, we hear business owners, they overestimate profits, underestimate expenses, and they really underestimate the time.
Yeah.
And we're in a world of AI and automation, and deliveries, like 2 days is like long-term planning in like Las Vegas. I want my Amazon stuff here tonight or tomorrow afternoon, and wait till we get drone delivery, right? So imagine adding 5 weeks to your process. Those are things we either want to avoid, or realistically, even better, be aware of what the time frame is and why, and be aware of others can't help themselves by over-promising to make the sale or the conversion. We're going to tell you the good, bad, and the ugly up front. If there is an exception, we'll let you know. We'll let you know the percentage of it might work. But we want you to be able, you got other things to plan out with inventory and team and sales, and there's so many factors going involved. You got to get this right so you're not frustrated, because that will cause more profits. You don't make good decisions, you don't think right, it all goes downhill pretty quickly. So that's why we want to help you launch with confidence, be realistic, and let's do it right from the start.
I work with sellers and CPG brands from around the world, and the US market is the market to be in, right? So if you're doing 10 million euros a year in Germany, well, you should be able to do at least that or more in the US market, right? If you've got a brand that converts. Now, it's quite tough for specifically European founders to understand how the US structure works, right? A lot of the German people I work with, for instance, they need a director or an owner in America, because that's how it works in Europe, right? And I do find that there's a lot of fear about compliance. I'm not talking about the guy who's a small startup seller who thinks he's watched the TikTok telling him to open an LLC and make millions in America. The guy's got a proper brand. They're doing 10, 20, 30, 50 million in Europe, in the UK, Australia. Now they're looking at their expansion into the US. For those guys, what are some of the common pitfalls that these non-residents, i.e. non-American sellers, genuinely make that you encounter that they could avoid?
So there's several. First of all, just from a tax planning point of view, if they're going to sell from the German entity on Amazon, which we know you can do, a lot of people assume inadvertently, because on the tax interview, I fill out the W-8BNE, I'm not subject to any U.S. taxes. And for most of you, that might be the case. But there's some situations you may trigger by attempting to work with a U.S. retailer. You need an office. They want some physical presence. There's usually something else that comes into play that you don't take a step back. How will this impact my German company? Did I create a permanent establishment? Am I now subject to U.S. taxes? Well, what is that going to look like? So that's more of an advanced concept. And then when you add different marketplaces, like you want to add TikTok Shop, well, they require a W-9. That means you got to create a U.S. person. That means that can't be a single member LLC disregarded, owned by the German company. Couldn't be owned by the German company because the ultimate beneficial owner has to be listed owns 25% or more. Could be 24%. So when you start expanding to these areas, you have to take a step back in the big picture, and we help you anticipate what the verification steps are. We're not going to penalize you because you didn't ask the right question. A lot of people do that, and they kind of like, well, you didn't ask me about that. Well, you're not the expert. We're going to anticipate what you're attempting to do. And I've seen this over the last year with banking, where some people might have a U.S. company and they had a bank account with Wells Fargo because they set it up 5 years ago, or with Citibank. And guess what last year? Maybe it was part of FinCEN and the BOI report, even though that went away for U.S. reporting companies, not by foreign reporting companies, by the way. But even though that went away, they're tightening up on banking. There's several banks that got fined millions and millions of dollars for not following the KYC rules. So these banks, for example, they want a real address, not even a virtual address. Well, what does that real address do to your U.S. tax responsibilities? Do you want to keep that account open? I know it's convenient, it's easy. So these are the type of things that, from a tax and verification point of view, that sometimes it's one step forward, two steps backwards, and we want to kind of anticipate in the overall picture what's the best approach. And sometimes you have to give up a little bit of convenience for the greater good.
And I suppose what also comes in here is this concept of permanent establishment. So people think, I've seen it, guys will come in and they'll do something in order to meet a verification process. Oh, I'm just going to use my friend's address as an office address. Well, now you've got a physical address. Well, I'm just going to employ this person in America, so I've got a physical person in America. Well, now you've got physical presence, right? And now you've got to pay tax in America versus this flowing through. I know that whole physical presence test for sellers can be a bit of a gray area, but in conjunction with the double tax treaty, a lot of the time it can flow through. But I suppose you'll also even have the discussion, maybe you want to pay tax in the USA rather than in Germany because the tax rates on the corporate tax is lower. But these shortcuts land up with consequences later on, don't they? So, I employ Bob, who's my cousin in Texas, in order to have a local address. I can have a US bank account. Well, later on, you suddenly land up paying taxes because of physical presence rules. I think those things to think about up front carefully are where I don't know anyone else who does what you do, to be honest, to the same level of detail. There should be more, right? I think there's some due diligence that should be happening. But that's why we send all of our larger brands to you, for instance, because first of all, they are so nervous about government, aren't they? Right? So someone from Europe is very nervous because they are used to a more regulated environment. And the guys who aren't worried usually do something stupid. So with all the risks noted, what are some of the benefits that you can think about of having a structure that's well thought through in America when you're setting up, whether it's a division, a parent company, whatever it may be?
Yeah, there's several that come to mind. So step number one of the strategies is, what category are you in? If you're in a high risk category like baby, exercise, supplements, we already know the U.S. is the biggest market in the world, which is fabulous. We also know U.S. people like to blame people for their problems, and that comes in the form of a lawsuit. And whether you're right or wrong, it doesn't matter. We're a registered agent here in Nevada, and a couple months ago, there was a lawsuit for a client selling clothing products on Shopify, and they're being sued by the state of California for price manipulation because they were offering, imagine this, they were offering different prices on their products. They had a Mother's Day sale. A couple months earlier was a different sales price. And there's some nuanced law in California that says that potentially that could fit into a bucket that is price manipulation. So whether they win it or not, and it's probably maybe the target market, the group of people they're serving, they weren't happy about it. It's actually a class action lawsuit. So for that reason, you have a $20 million brand in Europe, 50 million, and it doesn't have to be that category. You might say, I love the US, let me set up a separate legal entity to separate my business in Europe from my business in the US. Worst case, something happens in US, it doesn't affect my overall assets. They're all in one bucket. So now they're separated between two buckets. So that's consideration number one. Sometimes, based upon the marketplace, like TikTok or Walmart, depending on which countries, there's different exceptions. So for TikTok Shop, it requires a W-9. So that requires a U.S. company. So by default, you're forming a U.S. company. And then if you're going to try to qualify for Shopify payments, that requires a U.S. company. So there are situations like that. If you're going to do an exit, can you do an exit from a foreign company? Absolutely. Are there some buyers that would prefer to work with a U.S. company? Certainly. Are you working with U.S. retailers? Do you have a product that has pesticides in that can only be sold through a U.S. company? And then finally, with our current president, what's happening, of course, with tariffs and everything going on in the world, which is changing daily, there's this theme about buy from American companies, American brands, American manufacturers. Well, to be honest, most consumers, because I asked my wife, who buys on Amazon every single day, we got stuff coming to our house. I asked her, do you ever look at who you're buying your products from? Do you look at the sold by line? She goes, no, I just look at the price and options, and then I order. A lot of U.S. consumers are starting to do that. In many cases, of course, when they look at the reviews and they go down to the business name, you see a long Chinese name and a Chinese address. So this theme is starting to shift where some companies are like, I want that to show up as a U.S. company and the U.S. address. Now, obviously in Europe, you have limited companies. We have that option too. That's not as common. So sometimes it's hard to tell if it's a European company, if it's a U.S. company or that, but the address can make a difference. So these things might be something that can help in conversion or profits and sales. So all these factors come into play when you think about, do I need to add a U.S. company, and what are the benefits? What situation is going to be required? And of course, most of you are already selling through a foreign company. Then you're going to talk about, how do I get the profits from this U.S. company? Do I keep them in the U.S.? Do I bring them back to my foreign company? Then, of course, how does the ownership? Well, the ownership goes back to what we started talking about, which was before you form the company, LLC most common, could be taxed as C-corp, partnership, single member disregarded for non-residents. Who should be the manager and who should be the member? Well, when it's managed by a manager, you have flexibility in the operating agreement to determine maybe after the fact who the owner should be with proper planning. So all these factors come into play.
It can feel quite overwhelming for just about anyone inside of America. Coming from outside of America, I think the concept of the LLC with flow through as a potential is very confusing. And it's not just confusing for the founder / manager. It's also confusing for their accountants back home in Slovakia, Netherlands, England. They just don't know how to deal with that, right? So it's quite an interesting setup that almost stops some people from even trying. And I've kind of come across three different types of people. People who want to just use their UK entity or their German company to trade directly on Amazon and Shopify in America. I think you've pointed out really well some risks that brings. But it feels easier, doesn't it, right, to have one entity. Then people who will come along and use a US flow-through entity, specifically if there's a double tax treaty and you only got inventory in an FBA warehouse, you can kind of still flow that through based on the double tax treaty, but you got to do all the correct forms, right? You don't just ignore it. And And then the third type who actually sets up some type of C-corp, pays tax in America, and then does some type of invoicing arrangements, and they get to a certain size, they got to worry about transfer pricing. We've also seen a fourth type where someone might have a small brand in the UK and their US market has just gone huge. And they go, well, why do I need a UK company? So what they do is they just trade only under the US LLC, and then that US LLC or Inc. or C-corp or whatever also does the registers on Amazon in the UK, in Europe, in Australia. So they still have one entity, but it's the US entity, and they throw away the UK or European entity altogether. All of those have the right time, right place, but there's no one solution fits all. I think, is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And so what we've done is look at these different variables and factors. And of course, it's always best to start with, if it could be what's easiest and simple, and will that meet your needs, then we have to pause and say, what are you planning to do next? And okay, what else are you planning to do? Okay, will that change the strategy? So it's our job to anticipate problems with your simple approach. So if you have a foreign entity, did you need to get an EIN number or not? Did you need a resale certificate for working with the U.S. supplier? Maybe not. Did the importer or record take care of everything so you didn't need an EIN number? Well, should you get an EIN number and file a protective return? Is there anything you're doing could be construed as a permanent establishment, so you don't want an issue? And unfortunately, like most tax jurisdictions, well, especially in the U.S., they're famous for, we'll let you know if you made a mistake before the statute of limitations runs out. Like if it's 3 years, we'll contact you like when there's 2 months left. So we're going to maximize revenue, but you give it your best shot first and see if you can figure it out. Sales tax works that way. It's not like Europe with VAT registrations. Here it's like, you figure it out. And if you made a mistake, we'll maybe take a look at it and tell you, what do you owe in penalties and interest. So it is important to start with, where are you at? Can it be done through your foreign entity? Many companies do that all throughout the world, especially just on Amazon. Do you have any sales tax responsibilities? You get an EIN number that triggers a federal return, protected return. So you have to go through the steps and your brand and what does it mean to be in compliance. So, and some of these are challenging because it's not easy to get always the right answer. You could call a Secretary of State about sales tax and ask them, I'm an Amazon seller, I'm in Europe, German company, do I need to register in your state? Amazon's collecting my behalf. Well, depending upon who you talk to, like anything else in life, how you frame the question, you could get different answers. I've trained our team to talk to the auditors because they will, worst case scenario, tell you what they look at, not the front end receptionist. So can you transfer me to somebody in the VDA department, which is the voluntary disclosure department, or an audit department, and then ask them the question. And they'll later complain to the receptionist, why'd you let that call through? But we don't care about that. But we're trying to get the best answers. So these are some of the challenges, but we do like to say, hey, could you just do it from a foreign entity? What are you looking to accomplish? Okay, great. Here's some verification issues. From a conservative point of view, here's some tax things you can do. Oh no, you're going to try to qualify for Shopify payments. You're not in a country that allows you to sell in Walmart from your country. TikTok Shop, they do have it in the UK, but you might be in another country, but you want TikTok Shop in the US. Okay, then that's going to be a separate component. Now, do we combine your Amazon business with this new one? Do we keep it separate from the foreign one? Or do we just have the TikTok business go through here? And then what do we think the sales are going to be? We get into Shopify. Oh, we're going to add Shopify. What percentage of sales? What's that going to do to the complexity? Should we even go to Shopify? What's your reasoning? So these are some thought processes. And of course, we always want your accountant in your country, to be involved. And for us, somebody might say, do you work with just one person? We work with various people. I just met with one of my tax attorneys from Atlanta that does usually companies that are 50 to 200 million internationally, a lot in Latin America, very high-end tax attorney respected in the United States, and I met with him. We were talking about some of these issues, and if you want to sleep well at night as a major brand, he's a good guy to go to. It's not going to be inexpensive, but you'll know you can sleep well at night. Do we have some other level people, just like, the people that and different folks that can do some basic level returns that might be appropriate for a lot of people? So it depends what your risk tolerance is. What's your comfort factor? How's your brand going to respond? So we take all these things into consideration to really give you a thoughtful answer and plan moving forward. Then what we can do. Then we connect you with the right professionals that are getting the best answers as of today. And again, it's a moving target in the U.S. Sometimes it's like selling in 50 different countries, which is a little challenging, especially when it comes to sales tax. But it can be done. It can be managed. And there's no reason why you can't be successful. And the key ingredient is really to have this confidence. So when you have confidence about your compliance is in place, you've done it right. You don't have to look over your shoulder wondering if something's going to show up 3 years later. The confidence will be the ripple effect that goes in every other part of your business. And that's what helps generate profitability, because you have a solid foundation. You didn't take shortcuts. You did it right. And you can focus on sales and profitability. And if something happens, you're going to be protected. And to us, that's very valuable to give that gift to the entrepreneur.
I really like that, because I know I go back 10 years ago, my first Amazon brand that I launched, man, I remember and I'm a tax guy, right? I spent a decade doing international mergers and acquisitions. I should know how to do an Amazon tax interview, right? And man, it's quite complicated to go through, especially like, what is the single member LLC? I'm originally South African, so this flow through concept never entered into my world. And I was working in Europe, UK, and South Africa before America a decade ago. If I'm struggling with that, the average seller who's sitting in, Romania or England trying to figure out how to launch, all they've been told is get an LLC in Wyoming. Now they go and do that Amazon interview. I think it falls over, right? And what happens is they will have a try, mess it up, and then later on, they lose their access. They lose Amazon, which is a major problem. So Scott, we've spoken a lot now about the pros and cons, right? The complexities, and there's a huge amount of detail. I think it's quite daunting. The majority of our sellers start off wanting to sell on Amazon. And I know that in itself is a bit of a specialty and a niche that you do, right? So let's talk a little bit about how a non-US resident setting up to sell into the US marketplace can really master their Seller Central setup. What are the top priorities for them to cover?
The top two, you have to make absolutely sure you're clear on your business information, business address, business documents, separated from your personal information and your personal documents. You want to make sure that the address matches exactly what you put in the new Amazon Seller Central account, right? Periods, commas, abbreviations, all must match. And what happens is any little mismatch is going to kick you out and the account won't be verified. And then you're going to get to extra verification, which we'll talk about in a minute. So step one is to make sure, whether it's a foreign entity selling, you're setting up a new account, or you set up a U.S. single member LLC, disregarded, very common, and you set up a new account. Taking a step back from a strategy point of view, if your plan is you want to sell in the U.S. and you're a new seller, and you'd like to set up this single member LLC disregarded because you've read about that it's a little bit easier and maybe less complexity and could be owned by you, the mistake a lot of people make is they'll set up the Amazon account in their own name just to test it, to get it set up. And what I'm about to say next, I brought up to the head of partnerships 2 weeks ago at Amazon. I said, you have a glitch in your system. I don't know how to say it, but they don't like to hear that. So the glitch in the system is, it's the only marketplace And even for a U.S. seller, if I set up an Amazon account in my name and I set up a single member LLC disregarded, now I want the LLC name to be the business name and the seller profile, right? Because let's be honest, if the business is in your name, generally that gives a bad marketing message. You're a sole prop, a sole trader. You don't make much money yet. You're not sure what you're doing. So it's always better to typically have a company for the most part. So when you go to update the account and the LLC name as a single member LLC, as we mentioned earlier in the tax interview, the first question is a little bit tricky. You know, are you an individual? Are you a business? And you think you're a business because you formed an LLC. That sounds like a business. You got a tax ID number, right? But from the tax interview point of view, they look at you an individual. And so that's where people just get stuck on that part. And of course, this is after you set up the account, then you go to the tax interview, then you hope and pray you don't get an email 3 days later that says your account's not verified, and you get some general statement about some type of utility bill, which we'll get to in a minute. So you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot and just nilly-willy go set up the account and then figure out later what would be the best approach. So that's really the big picture, step number one. It was pointing out to Amazon, I said, every other business platform, if I start off a business in my name and I form an entity, in this case, a single member LLC disregarded, I want to update the platform. It allows me to change the business name and put in the tax ID number, maybe upload the articles, but your system doesn't.
Yeah.
So that's a little nuance that we have to be careful with when we set up our Amazon account.
It's, again, a European, Australian, South African who is jumping onto Amazon. They think they've got an LLC. They think that's a corporate, right? So they don't get the concept of this flow-through single-member LLC, where from Amazon's perspective, you're a sole prop, right? Like, you are the business, and therefore they want all the KYC stuff for you as an individual. Now, that I've seen sellers doing 10 million a year who set up like that, and then their business gets frozen. You're out of business, right? You're down for weeks to try and get that resolved. So doing that properly on day one, so important. I totally agree. If I'm declaring total honesty here, the very first time I set up my Amazon store, that's exactly what I did. And I put it in as a corporate, then try to change it. And, three months later, it was easier to register a new entity and start again, right?
And guess what? They don't like changes in the first 90 days. They don't like you to change the address or the bank account. And then, like you said, you're up and running, everything looks good. Then they shut your account down.
Yeah.
Then you have to get verified. The verification process is very challenging. And with AI, it's only making it worse short term because it's learning, and you may get a false positive where you provided the right documents, but they still reject it. It's very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, agreed. So I do see that a lot with startups, and quite frankly, I see that even with people who are already doing $1 million a year, right? Somehow they got through 4 years ago, and now there's an issue, right? So the Seller Central setup can be quite complicated. We've even seen some weird things where, you're a Spanish citizen, you've got a Spanish company, you're selling, and you don't want to set up a legal entity in the US. You start selling on the US, but you don't go and put your Spanish VAT number in, and suddenly the USA starts charging you for VAT on the Amazon fees, right? Because of these EST rules. Try and get that money back. That'll take you 8 months to a year, right? We've just helped someone get over $130,000 back. They were Australian, trading in an Australian entity. They didn't put the ABN number in correctly on Amazon USA or Amazon Europe Seller Central. And Amazon was just charging them the Australian GST and paying it to the government in Australia, right? They did pay it back, but it took us 8 months of emailing, and none of the big sales tax or VAT people could sort it out, right? So it was an individual you had to find there after an 8 months email chain. So I really like the thinking here is there's no shortcuts when setting these things up, right? Yeah, to spend a little bit of money up front saves you the risk of this business being shut down because of a painful verification, right? Um, the reality is you need someone to walk through this process with you. If you can't afford that, well, can you actually afford to be launching into America then? And we're not talking, I know what your fees are, so it's not a crazy cost. The cost of losing a day's trading, right, is way bigger than not having someone walk you through this upfront. So yeah, this is all about profitability for us. The biggest hit to profitability of a good business is being shut down where you can't trade for a month, right? Because you go to zero. And it's worse than zero because you're still getting fees for having inventory and all your people. So I really want to encourage people to take this a lot more seriously. We do live in a world where you've got a TikTok expert telling you how easy it is to register an LLC and start selling, or sell directly using a Wise account or whatever is your bank account. Generally, those things are not ending well. My experience, which I'd love to check your view on, is Amazon's getting stricter with these things. It's not becoming easier. These things are now becoming zero tolerance, right? Is that kind of a fair statement?
Yes, when I was at the Amazon headquarters last September, we had a special meeting for the partners, and I went to go talk to the onboarding team about some of the utility bill issues and which address to link it to and why is it still getting rejected. And what they said was, first, Scott, you should tell people it could take up to 2 months to set up their account. And separately, that's a different department, and they won't tell you that. You let us know on the front end. It takes 5 business days. Then they'll look at it, and we'll go from there. What people don't know is when you submit something to Amazon, most people are using templates and things that get rejected. And with AI, a lot of things are getting rejected might have been accurate. And there's also some conversations about at the front line, everything gets rejected because of more internal employee reward systems. So that's hard to overcome. And then people submit documents where it might be, okay, you need extra verification. Here's a utility bill. Something doesn't match. We had a banking situation where somebody in Australia, they just needed a personal bank account to verify it for the U.S. bank. Should be simple. Well, got rejected because their Australian personal bank account had their initials and last name, but their account was in their full name. They were the signer in the account. So it was as simple as that caused another couple weeks of delay. And another thing, when you go through this process, like things as simple as Relay and Mercury, we're partners with them. We have clients that say, I'll handle that part. And when you handle that part, that removes our ability to be involved. So if we send an email as a partner and say, hey, they're stuck at a verification level, can you help us out? They'll say, we can't tell you anything. It's private. It's their account. If we set up the account and we send an email, they'll send back and say, we'll tell the client just to schedule another call, and then we'll go through the verification. Here's what we recommend, and we'll get them onboarded. So you got to think about that aspect also. So all these factors come into play, which again is time and money, which impacts profitability. And again, we want to keep you and minimize frustration. Some things we can't control. Earlier this year, the IRS for US EIN numbers, guess what? They were off from the last week of December to January 20th, almost a full month. So that pushed back getting EIN numbers a month. So by the end of January, they were working on EIN numbers from late November. So that added, unfortunately, 6 weeks to the process that maybe would seem unnecessary. So you have to have some patience to understand as you're working on other things, how do I get this going? So if you're a seller looking to launch things, for the fourth quarter and take advantage of sales, don't, come to us on October 1st thinking you can get set up in 2 weeks. You just got to plan ahead. So that's another thought we want to share with everybody. Just make sure you allow enough time to get this done properly.
Yeah, and with all the changes in government staffing from the latest political changes, I'm hearing these things there's more and more delays being built into the system because of the change within those departments, right? So, Scott, we throughout today's call, we keep talking about LLC, C-corp, Inc., these different types of setups. Some of our viewers might have heard about S-corps, etc., right? Which, for the non-US residents, is not really applicable. I think there's also this concept of permanent establishment that gets wrapped up inside of all of this, whether you've got a legal entity or not, right? Let's take a moment just to talk about the different legal structures, specifically this LLC that's a flow through, and whether it's single member or multi-member. Can you take a moment just to help understand what that means?
Sure. So here's a couple of the basics. So if we set up a U.S. single member LLC, it's disregarded. The profits or losses, we say profits, but you might have losses, flow through to whoever the member is. And we talked about that. The member could be you as a foreign individual, could be a foreign company. So it's disregarded from the standpoint that in this case, there's some basic returns that are filed. The pro forma 1120 and a 5472 are some basic returns filed with the IRS. And they are important because one does have a $25,000 fine, even though there's no taxes paid. It's just information reporting forms. So you got to do those. And the profit will flow through. Then the question is, if you're a non-resident, do I need to pay taxes that's flowing out of the country to me individually? And one of the reasons people get confused on this is going back to Amazon's tax interview, they fill out a W-8-BEN. I'm sure nobody really reads it that closely, but if you actually read it, it says you don't have a U.S. trade or business, you don't have effectively connected income. So you naturally assume I'm not subject to U.S. taxes, which could be a big mistake. That form is really there for what's something that's called FDAP income. That's a 30%, has to do with royalties on Amazon, which is a whole different subject. It's not meant for this particular subject. So you have to determine, do I owe U.S. tax individually? And do I have something called a U.S. trade or business effectively connected income? And you'll read many different subjects on this. And one of the misconceptions I've seen on the internet a lot is, well, if I don't have dependent agents working in the U.S., I don't have a U.S. trade or business effectively connected income. And that's incorrect. That applies to tax treaties under the permanent establishment discussion, which we'll get to in a moment. So you have to do an analysis, and don't be surprised if you see some people say you don't have to pay any U.S. tax, or you do. So what I did in my research, I hired tax attorneys on tax treaties specifically to go through it. And it is an analysis. So it's not black or white, and it would be easy if it was black or white. So let's assume, worst case scenario, you're in a situation you have to pay U.S. taxes and you file what's called a 1040-NR, and you pay some taxes, and then for most of you, you're going to get a foreign tax credit in the country you're at. Tax rates are probably similar. You're not going to be per se double taxed in most situations. It gets more complicated if you're in Dubai or Hong Kong or some of these countries that maybe there's not a treaty with. And so that requires a little extra thought to planning to make sure you're on the same page. So generally the profits flow through to the individual. Now, if they flow through to a foreign country or to a foreign entity in a foreign country, then there's a different level looking at it. Then you got to really be careful is, did the foreign entity create, as you said, a permanent establishment, which is usually some type of a U.S. office, or you hired someone? And like you said, did I need somebody to sign on my bank account? Did I need to get a lease agreement on a warehouse to keep my Wells Fargo account opening? Did I inadvertently create that? And you might argue that if you drill down into the definitions, well, it was kind of an empty office. We weren't doing any work from there. I think if I was audited, I could survive that. That's all fine. You just got to work with someone that, if you want to take that position, could defend that. So you just have to be careful. We don't know where the administration is going. Up until this point, nobody's really thought about we should audit, Amazon for the W-8-BENs. And maybe take a look at them because there's no 1099s. So, and then sometimes we get people that maybe we'll just do a C-corp and we don't have to worry about this analysis and figuring this out, that out. And What are you going to do with the profits? Maybe it's a low profit level. Then we look at some other things. So these are some considerations that you probably want to take a look at in the overall big picture.
Yeah, and you got to look at it in context of your own home country as well, right? So, even if you've got a C-corp in America and you're getting taxed at 21%, if you're based in most European countries have controlled foreign company rules, right? So if you're paying a lower tax rate, they will usually capture the difference between their local tax rate at corporate and what you're paying in the USA. And well, we also got to make sure that I've moved to Dubai, right? So what's happening, Dubai, there's no double tax treaty. And I meet sellers here all the time who go, oh, I've got a US LLC, I pay no taxes in America. Hang on, you're an e-commerce seller. You've got inventory in 3PL and Amazon warehouses, and you're selling 90% of your sales via Amazon on American market to American clients. I kind of think you might have some permanent establishment discussions that you should consider, right? And you speak to 3 CPAs and you get 26 answers, but there is some misconception that people just take the view that there's no permanent establishment. I'm happy if you decide to take that view, but understand that there's a risk. Well, maybe you do get audited, right? And maybe you are deemed to have a permanent establishment. And in Dubai, there's no double tax treaty. So for our clients, for instance, who are in the UK, and they've got that kind of flow through setup, even though we might feel they've got permanent establishments, we'll report that, right? We'll do the 1120 pro forma, etc., or if they're a multi-member, the 1065, and we'll declare in the 1040. But what we'll do then is, I think it's the Form 8833, where you then go and lock in the double tax treaties for those countries that go, if the only reason for permanent establishment is inventory in an agent's warehouse, well, then it's not USA, it's UK. But then we try and take the low risk approach, so we don't land up spending a fortune on lawyers later on. The point is, don't assume that the 5 seconds that you watched on TikTok telling you you won't pay any taxes if you have a US LLC is accurate. Get the details. Otherwise, you get this horrible surprise 3 years down the line. You haven't put aside the taxes, right? So if you get I'm going to say something which hopefully no one in any of the state departments is looking at. When you get an email from the IRS or from one of the states saying that you owe them money, a lot of the time they've made up a number, right? It's not like they know what your Amazon and Shopify number is. They've thumbsucked a number and sent you a horrifying number. Well, now you got to go and defend that, right? Is it worth it? Is it worth all that extra stress thinking you owe 200 grand in, some random tax in a state? Why not just do it properly at the beginning, right?
Yeah, 100%. So these are things you got to, get both tax teams on the same page, be aware of what the pluses and minuses can be. Really important. We get a lot of people that do Hong Kong also. Imagine having a single member LLC owned by Hong Kong, and if you had a permanent establishment by the Hong Kong company in the US, now you're subject to 21% corporate taxes. Imagine 30% branch profit tax that's normally reduced by the treaty, but there is no treaty. So now you're at 51% tax, and that'll never show up unless you're audited. And you can play, you can decide what level of risk, but there's ways to just be careful you don't put yourself in that position to minimize your exposure. And some of that's as simple as, what are we doing for banking? Are we doing Shopify payments? Okay, well, we're going to go to Stripe. Well, Stripe, they want an ITIN number once you get to 500,000 in sales. Oh, we can't do that on the C-corp up front, so how do we do that? So it's like playing chess a little bit. So you got to kind of think ahead of some of these moves, and that's what we help people do. And we refer them to the high-level experts, depending upon the level of expertise they need and what we can handle on the front end, and work with folks like yourself and your team. And overall, if you take a little bit longer to plan it out before rushing into it, again, it all comes back to the certainty and confidence. Then you'll sleep well at night. Everything else goes better. You can focus on other areas that bring profitability. You're not going to have this surprise 3 or 4 years later. You're not going to have a sales tax issue. I mean, a lot of the states the last couple of years in their sales tax returns, if you sold a company, they want to know who the owner was. So then go look at to see if they were collecting sales tax. That wasn't there 5 years ago. So they're getting smarter. So you got to kind of, again, think ahead, then you'll be fine. And you can take advantage of the markets. And sometimes the decision may be, you know what, maybe we won't move to this marketplace. Maybe the added value and the complexity, maybe that just all doesn't make sense for us at this point in time. And that could be a conclusion we come to.
I think the ability to plan that out up front, even if it slows you down by a month, is far more valuable than possibly being shut down or having trading ceased or paused for an unknown amount of time in a year's time. And people think it's never going to happen to them, but I've seen it happen to a much larger number of sellers than I'd like to admit. And there's nothing you can do then, right? You're part of the process of moving from AI to human being one, human being two, trying to get someone to talk to you. Don't do it, right? I think that's just the only bit of advice I've got. And Scott, I've evolved personally in this, right? I used to be quite relaxed, experienced it, seen it with clients. I've become almost super conservative. You know, we've spoken about it. As soon as we've got any kind of seller who's over 10 million in sales, it's like, don't mess around to try and save a few grand. Talk to Scott, follow the process, you know, do it properly on day one. Otherwise, you're going to lose your business, right? You're going to send a couple of $100,000 worth of inventory and it's just going to sit there in America while you mess this up. Do it properly. And that, I think, leads to wise decision making, right?
Yeah, 100%. You'll find that the wealthier you become, the more risk adverse you are. And because you want to hold on to your money because you realize the blood and sweat and tears you went through to build it.
Yeah.
And, you know, other people may look at you as this overnight success, but you know the reality of the story. So you want to protect it and keep it. So you, for the most part, know that that only makes sense.
Agreed. Scott, naturally, we've spoken a lot about Amazon, right? Majority of purchases in online retail still happens on Amazon. Shopify, you've mentioned some of the complexities and the reason why you would have a US entity for Shopify payments. It's not the only option. We're seeing a lot of our clients now also wanting to talk about, well, what are the consequences of big box retail in America, right? Their wholesale business. And then TikTok, I got to be honest, TikTok's got my mind very confused about how that works. Could we end up with, you know, some insights from you on those two sales channels specifically?
Yeah, 100%. So working with U.S. retailers, some people are drop shipping, some are getting their products in retail stores. For example, we've seen some retailers, if you form a Wyoming company, some will just reject it, not respond to you, because there's so many people from certain countries that do things and they have challenges, so they just reject it. When you work with, you know, big suppliers or retailers in the U.S. or retail chains, you know, it depends on where you're at, but a lot of times they want an exemption certificate or what's called a resale certificate. And I've seen some people come back to us and said, Scott, they requested a resale certificate in 45 states. And I said, well, they don't quite know what they're asking for. There's only about 9 states where you got to have an in-state one. California is one of them. So odds are they should accept, for the most part, one resale exemption certificate, so we don't have to register in a bunch of states. And there's different ways to do that. So sometimes we get into that complexity, but they all want to work with a U.S. company, right? And they want credibility. Like even Walmart has, it's a little bit different, but they have a question, do you have a Dun & Bradstreet number? And it's optional. Why are they asking? Because a lot of quote unquote real U.S. companies have a Dun & Bradstreet number, which is a business credit score number for a company. And some of these retailers may pull a Dun & Bradstreet on your company. Well, guess what? Most sellers look financially naked because there is no report. So they never got a DUNS number. They didn't know how to build it. It's not critical to getting credit, and that's a different subject for U.S. sellers. But it could be a small factor that comes into play working with bigger retailers that want to check out your company, your presence, What does your address look like? Is it a P.O. box? Is it not? All these little factors add to credibility that come into play. So those are a couple things to keep in mind for that. And you got to be careful where you end up having inventory, what state. Some people pick an address out of New York because it looks cool. We're in New York City. Well, do we have to foreign register in New York? Do we got to pay New York taxes? Do we want an address there? The only thing worse than New York is California. So there are a couple of things we got to think about that so we don't kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. When it comes to TikTok Shop, which is, of course, one of the hottest subjects, I spoke to the onboarding team at the Consumer Electronics Show back in January to confirm a couple things, and recently became a TikTok Shop partner. And so they really want to work with U.S. businesses that fill out a W-9. And the big issue is they want you to have a U.S. Primary business representative. So that has to be somebody in the U.S. They don't have to have ownership. They could have ownership. And the challenge is we get a lot of people are looking for what's the company that provides this service, right? Well, the challenge with TikTok is they only allow 5 accounts under the same ID. So if it's a driver's license or a passport, that means one person can only be on 10 accounts. So that's why we see some agencies that maybe have a smaller amount of clients. The agency, because you're spending so much money each month, they might say, we'll be your primary business representative for TikTok Shop. Then you are the ultimate beneficial owner, owns 25% more as a non-resident. But there's a bunch of verification issues in between that can become challenging to get accepted and verified by TikTok Shop. And again, coming back full circle, they want a W-9, so no single member LLC. If we get into a partnership, we didn't talk much about that. That gets a little more complicated because if you are a U.S. trade or business effectively connected income, there's some withholding rates that are quite high. They could be reduced, but that gets more involved. Then you get a C-corp, and we got to go through that. So TikTok Shop is very popular, can be done, requires a U.S. entity, working with U.S. retailers. They want to work with a U.S. company. And you really got to forecast at the end of the day, where do you want your money to flow? Where do you want the profits to flow? Like I work with a group of Chinese sellers. They want to get their money out of China into the U.S. to buy U.S. real estate. It's a whole different strategy. So you got to think through where do you want the money to end up. They want to get an L1 visa so they can come back and forth to the U.S. That's a whole different subject. So these are some things that could come into play potentially in your overall planning that you want to think about where the profits end up. And we keep saying profits and time and money. A lot of it's reinvesting going forward. So maybe at someday you're going to plan an exit. And we got to think about that a little bit too in the overall scheme of things and what's going to be involved in that. So these are some of the factors that come into play.
You said earlier it's sort of like playing chess. I think it's a bit like playing 3D chess, right? It's not an easy setup. So Scott, I think we've covered quite a lot today. I don't think anyone's going to come away from this thinking that they can do this themselves. What's the best approach for someone to get hold of you, to work with you, and what makes for a really good fit? What would be a good person to work with you and your team?
So if you are a seller that you're looking to do a little more comprehensive planning up front to think through these subjects, and you want it mapped out step by step, or maybe you want to have a detailed conversation about the big picture first, that's somebody who's ideal for us. If you're just looking for a little nuance, it's kind of like going to the doctor. If you go to the doctor, say my shoulder hurts, and hey, can you just write me a pain pill prescription? They're not going to do that. Same thing. We're not good at just, hey, I need a utility bill. Can you get that for it? We know it's not going to work, and we just don't want to do that to you. So that's not a good fit. So the best way to get hold of us and to get to me is first do a call with our team. We can go to our website, nvinc.com. Looks like Nevada Inc., nvinc.com. There's a button to Let's Talk. There's a discovery call with our team. It clarifies. Our goal is to find out about your situation, where are you at, what stage in the process, and then let you know if that might be best served with a a strategic call with myself about the verification and tax process so we get clear. Or we also will share with you, we have verification plans where we can map everything out for you. And then we can either jump into forming the entity or fixing one you've already formed and reviewing it, looking at what you did with the IRS and is there any amendments? Do we have to change the address to get everything moving forward? So those are the categories. We start with a free call. That may go directly to me, or it might be one of the packages, and there's a couple things I'm involved in. And we do strategic email follow-ups and consulting. Our team is like clockwork when it comes to the back end and all the details that go into everything. They will anticipate and they're trained if something doesn't look right to let you know, or they'll double check with me to make sure from a compliance point of view we're moving forward. So that's the process. It's very straightforward. We'd love to work with you. And if we, after a strategy call, which it's recorded, you have the transcripts, you can put that in the AI and create your own checklist. All that stuff can be done. If there's a resource you need that's going to solve a particular problem, like we work with the best of the best in the industry. So we know who might be a better fit for you based upon your risk tolerance and what stage you're at in the process. And so we can also do that for you also.
Great, Scott. And for our listeners, I can't recommend getting in touch with you earlier rather than later. I personally look to use you, not just for clients, but for our businesses. And I know quite a bit about this stuff, and I feel out of my depth. The level of knowledge that you've accumulated, it's been interesting talking to you over, I think we've been talking for about 4 or 5 years now. The change in how you've developed your knowledge base, your service offering has been exceptional to watch, because the pace of change in this industry has been out of this world, right? I remember when I started in this space, thinking about what I had to cover was scary back then. Today, it's almost, there's no individual, unless this is what you do, 40 hours a week, every day for 5 years, you're not going to actually understand all of this stuff. So if you want to go do it by yourself, good luck, but you probably are going to make some unwise decisions. So this is becoming it's almost like a go-to. Anyone who is in Europe, Australia, UK gets hold of us. Getting started with you has become kind of one of our checklists. We don't want, if you just registered a little Wyoming LLC and you want to get trading, probably going to be a really bad client for us to work with, because you're going to be out of business in a year. So anyway, I'm carrying on a bit about how important this is, because I've seen what goes wrong. So Scott, I really appreciate your time. We'll put down a link in the comments and the details section for this recording. And I look forward to kind of seeing how people benefit and start making use of this on a wider scale. Thanks so much for your time, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's been a pleasure. Look forward to working, with your clients and those who are watching to make sure it's done right. And we always have the latest and greatest as far as what works, what doesn't work. And again, the goal is for you to have confidence so that ripple effect will carry forward everything else you're doing in your business, so you can focus on profitability for you, your business, and your family. At the end of the day, that's what's most important.
And I think that just closes us off with some really wise thinking. Without that foundation, are you making wise choices to be profitable later on? Scott, thanks so much, and look forward to talking again in the future.